is entitled Examining the Operations of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. The free flow of capital is a bedrock tenet of the United States economy. Ensuring that free flow worldwide has always been a bipartisan goal, and to that end, I am proud to serve as co-chair of the Global Investment in America Caucus, along with our colleagues Mr. Holding, Mr. Himes, and Mr. Meeks. The caucus promotes global investment in the United States economy and helps educate members about the importance of foreign direct investment. Today, the United States is both the largest foreign investor and the recipient of the greatest amount of foreign direct investment. That capital has provided a good deal of the energy that has kept our economy vibrant, compensating to some extent for our notoriously low national savings rate to provide the fuel for growth of U.S. businesses and jobs. Today, almost 5% of U.S. workers and jobs are related to foreign investment. Most of these jobs pay handsomely, far better on average than other U.S. jobs. But if foreign investment is to be a force for good, it must not be welcomed unthinkingly, any more than one might leave the front door of a house open around the clock. Investment that might weaken us is not good or welcome investment, and we must guard against it. That investment might come for purely economic reasons, but especially in this era of international turmoil, conflict, and economic uncertainty, it can also come from individuals or nation-states that might wish to weaken our economy in comparison to theirs, or try to spirit away technology or know-how that could strengthen their military to gain an advantage over ours. To maintain a vigilant watch on investment, the Multi-Agency Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, reviews many inbound investments to determine if they pose a threat to national security. This involves rigorous scrutiny of proposals by all appropriate departments or agencies, including a scrub by the intelligence community, and the President has the power to block transactions or order divestment if such concerns cannot be mitigated by a change in the original proposal. Today, we face new threats on a number of fronts, not just the threat of a hollowed-out industrial sector, but also from terrorism and from major nations that are economic competitors, but also potential military competitors. I'm referring, of course, mainly to China. Concerns have risen sharply in past years about Chinese companies using that country's vast financial reserves to acquire key technology with an eye towards taking the lead in the industrial markets of the future. The Chinese government, for example, has set aside $250 billion to be used in dominating the vital semiconductor market. This is not a new phenomenon, but just a new challenger. President Ford set up CFIUS in 1975 out of concern that the vast inflows coming from OPEC countries could weaken our economy. In 1988, among concerns that Japan was seeking to buy critical technology, Congress gave President Reagan the authority to actually block deals. That authority only has been used sparingly. Interestingly, the first use came when President George H.W. Bush blocked the sale of an airplane component maker to a Chinese company. More recently, President Obama, just before he left office, blocked a Chinese deal, and President Trump already has blocked the proposed purchase of Lattice Semiconductors by a Chinese company. CFIUS has also approved foreign direct investment conditionally, approving a deal only when divestment of divisions with sensitive technologies or activities has occurred. But the statute under which CFIUS operates has not been updated in a decade, and clearly we should think about modernizing it. Aside from China's intentions, there are burdens on the CFIUS process from the volume and complexity of proposed deals. There were about 40% more reviews in 2017 than 2016, and a more than fourfold expansion in the number of Chinese-backed deals just since 2013. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. I really appreciate your expertise in this vital matter for our national interest, and I certainly appreciate the importance of foreign direct investment in the United States. We want to be clear that we're talking about things that would be counter to our national security interest, but not things that would be counter to our national interest. We want foreign direct investment. We don't want to give away our national secrets, even at a high price, if they would jeopardize the security of our country. I became concerned about this when I was a cadet at West Point. And in 1993, one of the first things the Clinton administration did was transfer release authority for sensitive technology from Department of Defense to Department of Commerce. And we proceeded to sell via Hughes the capability to China to launch multiple satellites, in this case, not warheads, off of one launch vehicle. It seemed tantamount to treason to me at the time, but it was really a commercial decision. But it seemed really a bad thing for U.S. national security.
Mr. Siegel, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Barr, Ranking Member, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. My purpose...
Pull your microphone towards you. Thank you.
My purpose is to provide a context for Chinese activities and what the motivations and challenges might be. I'm going to make three points. The first is that China has a comprehensive strategy to move up the value chain and develop high technologies for national security and economic interest. That strategy involves many parts. It involves increased investments in R&D and science and technology, industrial policy, and in particular, policies focused on semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and what's called Made in China 2025, which is the use of the Internet of Things and automation on manufacturing. It has its own forward investment regime, which forces foreign companies to transfer technology and fails to protect IPR. And it is involved in cyber and industrial espionage. And then finally, it is involved in foreign acquisition. So can it acquire those technologies in the United States, Europe, India, Israel, and other locations? So the policy that China has adopted is broad and comprehensive, and any U.S. response will similarly have to be broad and comprehensive. Second, as a number of people have already noted, the investment decisions behind Chinese firms is often opaque. Who the actors are is opaque. They may say that they are private. They may, in fact, be private, but still receive significant support from state-owned enterprises. They may have tight connections to local or provincial governments. And so the sources of the money and the motivations of that money are often unclear. They may be strategic. They may be economic. It may be hiding money from corruption scandals. The problem is compounded by the fact that President Xi Jinping has accelerated a process that was started under President Hu Jintao of civil-military fusion. And that goal is to tightly link the civilian and military economies so that any benefits that are brought to the civilian economy are eventually turned into military strength as well. And so that means that in this context, any advantage that's brought to the civilian economy could also be brought to the military economy. Third and final, while I support many of the specific reforms that have been mentioned about increased capacity, increased information sharing, and other points for CFIUS, it is extremely important to point out that the U.S. and Chinese technology platforms and systems are increasingly integrated. We've seen that in information technologies where it is very, very hard to draw a line between where China starts and where the United States starts. We see a massive flow of people back and forth. We see investment. We see a huge amount of co-research and co-writing of research papers. When Chinese scientists look for co-authors, they look to the United States. Over 40% are U.S. authors. And this pattern is going to be reproduced in these new areas of frontier technology. Right, so we already see this in AI and artificial intelligence, that the two systems, although right now are often cast as competitors, as running a race against each other, they are going to be tightly integrated. And Google's announcement yesterday that it was setting up an R&D center inside China is just the most recent example of how tightly linked those systems are going to be. That means that for any type of either export control law or CFIUS reform, there is a high degree of chance that we could, in fact, hurt ourselves, that we would be affecting science and technology that feeds back into the U.S. system, that drives U.S. companies, and drives at U.S. innovation. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
With Dubai Ports, we had a company that happened to be owned by the government. And that government was, at the time, supporting international terrorism. should we have in any CFIUS law a provision that says you explicitly must take into account whether the host government of whatever company is making the investment supports terrorism, whether or not is a state sponsor of terror? Does anyone have a comment? Anybody here think that we shouldn't take into consideration whether the company making an investment in U.S. assets is based in a country that supports terrorism?
Mr. Chairman, I think at Treasury, which I know
Right.
a bit better, although the CFIUS process is run by the International Affairs Division, as you know, the people in TFI, terrorist finance, comment on every
They comment, but there's not an explicit provision that says it might be a wonderful company buying a wonderful asset. It just happens to be based in Tehran. That wouldn't, and there's nothing in the law that I read that you can point to that says that that would be one of the factors, correct?
There's nothing specifically in FINZA, although, as you know, in the wake of CNOOC and Dubai ports, there was much greater scrutiny put on acquisitions by state-owned or controlled entities.
I'm not just talking about state-owned or controlled entities.
No, but I would say where you will find that specific language is in legislation that you've passed and executive orders that have been issued by the President on state sponsors of terrorism, including the Iranians and others. So
the government or private enterprises based in Tehran?
I would say both. I mean,
And you'd say it would be rejected just on that basis, or what weight would it be given?
certainly if it were a company based in Tehran, it would be rejected, I think, outright. But I think the key point that you're making...
Maybe Dubai we would look at it more carefully. I would point out that we may be looking too narrowly when we look at ownership or control of a company, as if you have to have seats on the board to control them. And I'll give you one example. We've allowed a terrible situation in our weak position with China. So they're able to turn to Boeing and say, we won't buy your planes unless you make the fuselages here in China. So they don't have anybody on the board, they don't own any stock, but they control corporate decisions. Now, I don't know whether it was the fuselage or the wing assembly, and I don't know whether that poses a risk to our national security or our intellectual property, but I do know that once we consent to a situation where a country can have a huge trade surplus with us, over $300 billion, and then turn to our companies and say, and you can't even sell your products here unless you transfer this technology, unless you build this plant here, unless the patents are located here, unless the computer system or cloud is located here, that we may be looking over at corporate ownership and not looking at corporate control. The fact is, if you can close your markets, you can control corporate decisions.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for appearing today. I think this is an exceedingly important hearing, and I'm very much concerned about assuring ourselves that we are on the right course. Mr. Siegel, you have indicated that unilateral action may not be sufficient, that there is something more that we have to do so as to protect our U.S.-originated science and technology. Would you give some additional intelligence on this, please?
The fundamental issue is that there are very few, if any, science and technology issues that the United States still monopolizes. And so for any technology that the United States has decided that it represents a dual-use threat, it is very possible to go find, except for a very, very narrow range of technologies, similar producers. To give just an example on issues on cybersecurity or AI or computer science or technology, the Chinese are sending delegations to Israel from every week. And while the Israelis are more aware of our concerns about dual use, they're not going to find in the same ways that we are in every instance. So I think the issue is that unless you have a fairly broad set of agreements among your partners, it'll be very easy for Chinese actors to find most technologies in other markets.